The entire dining room of Aurelia, a place where whispers were louder than conversations, fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. A woman's shriek, sharp and ugly, had just sliced through the delicate symphony of clinking silver and muted string quartets. All eyes snapped towards table 7, where a young waitress stood frozen, a crimson stain of Bordeaux blooming across the pristine, white tablecloth like a grotesque flower. "You incompetent little fool!" The woman, dripping in diamonds that seemed to catch and amplify her fury, was on her feet. Her hand was raised, palm open, poised to strike. "Look what you've done! This is a $5,000 dress! Do you have any idea what that means?" Standing between the enraged socialite and the terrified waitress was not a child, but the looming, unimpressed form of the restaurant's manager, his face a mask of practiced apology. But the real drama wasn't the impending slap. It was the quiet, steady voice of the waitress, a girl no older than 20, her body trembling, but her words as clear as a bell. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I didn't spill that wine. You threw it." Phones were already emerging from Chanel purses and the inner pockets of bespoke suits. The woman at table 7, Mrs. Evelyn Reed, gasped, her face contorting with a theatrical disbelief that was almost impressive. Her hand, once raised to strike, now clutched at her pearls. The manager's expression shifted from placation to alarm, the dawning realization that this was no simple accident. This was an escalation, a public spectacle that was about to spiral catastrophically out of his control. Other diners were murmuring, the sound growing from a low hum to an audible buzz. A reclusive billionaire in the corner booth, a man who hadn't been seen in public for years, lowered his newspaper for the first time all evening, his gray eyes sharp and analytical. Missing nothing. To understand how a Tuesday evening at New York's most exclusive restaurant became a flashpoint that would unravel a carefully constructed empire, we have to go back. Back to 12 hours earlier, when a young woman was just trying to balance a chemistry textbook with the crushing weight of her reality. Clara Evans stood in the cramped kitchen of her 4th-floor walk-up in Queens, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and the faint, medicinal scent of her grandmother's liniment. At 20, she possessed a weariness that didn't belong on her young face. Her eyes, a warm shade of hazel, held a deep, quiet intelligence that most people overlooked. They saw the faded waitress uniform, the sensible shoes, the hands that were perpetually chapped from hot water and harsh detergents. They didn't see the mind behind them, a mind grappling with organic chemistry formulas and the complex, heartbreaking cartography of dementia. "My name is Eleanor Vance," her grandmother's voice drifted from the other room, thin and reedy. "I was born in 1948. My husband's name was Arthur." Clara closed her eyes, a familiar ache tightening in her chest. It was the loop, the same 3 facts repeated over and over, an anchor her grandmother, Eleanor, clung to in the swirling fog of her dissolving memory. Clara was doing something she did every single day. She was practicing patience. "That's right, Grandma," Clara called out, her voice bright and steady. "And Arthur was a very handsome man, wasn't he?" "Oh, the handsomest," Eleanor's voice replied, a moment of genuine light breaking through. On the small, cluttered kitchen table, next to a stack of overdue bills, sat Clara's prized possession, a textbook on phytochemistry, the study of chemicals derived from plants. A pressed leaf was tucked between the pages, a perfect 5-lobed specimen from a ginkgo tree she'd found in the park. She was a scholarship student at Columbia, majoring in botany and horticultural science, a passion that felt a universe away from her nightly reality of serving foie gras and truffled pasta to people who spent more on a single bottle of wine than she made in a month. But that passion was her lifeline. In the intricate, logical world of plant biology, everything had a purpose, a reason. It was the perfect antidote to the chaotic, unpredictable decline of the woman who had raised her. Eleanor had been a landscape architect, a woman who could make gardens sing. Their tiny apartment was a testament to her former life, with resilient snake plants, sprawling pothos vines, and a stubborn orchid that Clara coaxed into blooming once a year. It was Eleanor who had taught Clara to see the world through a botanist's eyes, to notice the subtle curl of a leaf signaling thirst, to identify a tree by its bark in the dead of winter, to understand the silent, powerful language of the green world. Now, those skills were mostly used to keep their small jungle of houseplants alive, a living memorial to the woman her grandmother used to be. The wall of their small living room told a story in faded photographs, a vibrant Eleanor designing a public park, a younger Clara, maybe 5 years old, covered in mud, proudly holding up a carrot she'd grown in their community garden plot. A photo of Clara's high school graduation, Eleanor standing beside her, the first hints of confusion just beginning to cloud her sharp eyes. There were no pictures of Clara's parents. They were a story of addiction and abandonment, a void Eleanor had filled with twice the love and fierce determination. Now it was Clara's turn to be the fierce one. Working at Aurelia was both a blessing and a curse. The tips were phenomenal, the only reason she could afford her grandmother's medication and the part-time caregiver who stayed with her during Clara's classes. But the job was a nightly immersion in a world of casual cruelty and breathtaking entitlement. She learned to be a ghost, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to absorb thinly veiled insults with a serene professional smile. She'd learned to protect herself by becoming invisible. "Okay, Grandma," she said, entering the living room with a tray. "Time for your breakfast. And look, I repotted your African violet." She placed a small pot with its fuzzy leaves and delicate purple flowers on the windowsill. Eleanor looked at the plant, then at Clara, her eyes vacant for a moment. "That's lovely, dear. Who are you again?" Clara's practiced smile didn't falter. "I'm Clara, Grandma. You're Clara." She squeezed her grandmother's frail hand. "We protect each other. That's what family does." In that moment, Clara saw so much of the old Eleanor in her own reflection in the window. The resilience, the quiet strength, the unwavering sense of duty. Across town in a sprawling Park Avenue penthouse that told a very different story, Evelyn Reed was starting her day with rage. At 52, she was a masterpiece of surgical enhancement and punishing discipline. Her face a taut, unlined mask, her body honed to a weaponized thinness. Her morning ritual didn't involve coffee. It involved berating her personal assistant over a perceived scheduling error. "I don't care if the gala is for charity," she hissed into her phone. "My table must be front and center. I am not to be seated near the Thorntons." Her facelift is an absolute travesty. Her apartment was a monument to wealth, but a specific kind of wealth. New, loud, and deeply insecure. Every surface was reflective. Every piece of art was famous. Every brand name was conspicuously displayed. Bills weren't piled on the counter. They were handled by a team of accountants. Her biggest financial pressure was deciding which multi-million-dollar property to summer at. Her husband, Arthur Reed, a quiet, unassuming man who had made a fortune in private equity, entered the room, already dressed in a somber suit. He had long ago retreated into a shell of weary resignation. "Evelyn, please, it's 7 in the morning." "Don't you, Evelyn, please me," she snapped, ending her call. "It's your fault we're even in this position. If your bid for the museum board seat had been successful, I wouldn't have to fight for social relevance like some commoner." Arthur sighed. He'd built an empire from nothing, but he'd never managed to build his wife's self-esteem. Evelyn had come from a middle-class background, and she spent every waking moment trying to erase that fact, wielding her husband's money like a shield and a sword. Her fear of being seen as an outsider, of not truly belonging, had curdled into a permanent, simmering hostility, especially towards anyone in a service position. They were reminders of a life she'd escaped, and she treated them with the contempt she secretly held for her own origins. At a pre-luncheon coffee with a friend, another woman of similar vintage and vanity, Evelyn's prejudice was on full display. "The service everywhere has simply gone to pot," she declared, stirring her cappuccino with unnecessary vigor. "Last week at Bergdorf's, the salesgirl had the audacity to suggest a dress that was last season. As if I wouldn't know." Her friend nodded sympathetically. "It's the entitlement of the younger generation. They expect everything handed to them." Evelyn leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You can always tell the ones who are just temporary, the students, the aspiring actresses. They have that look, a complete lack of deference. They think they're better than their station. That evening, as she meticulously applied her makeup for dinner at Aurelia, she checked the reservation on her tablet. A corner table, just as she demanded. She was meeting her husband and a potential business partner, a reclusive tech billionaire named Julian Croft, who was notoriously difficult to pin down. This dinner was important. It was a power play, a chance to solidify the Reed name among New York's true elite. She was determined to project an aura of effortless class and absolute control, but her insecurity was dressing itself up as authority, and that combination was a lit match in a room full of dynamite. In a quiet, cavernous mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, Julian Croft was also getting ready for dinner, though with none of Evelyn's theatricality. At 68, he had the lean build of a former runner and a face etched with the kind of lines that came from intense thought rather than laughter. He moved through his home, a stunning example of minimalist architecture, with the quiet economy of a man accustomed to being alone. The house was a shrine to his late wife, Amelia. Her paintings, abstract landscapes bursting with color, were the only warmth in the sterile gray and glass space. He paused in front of a portrait of her, a candid shot taken in her greenhouse. Her hands were covered in dirt, and she was laughing, her face tilted toward the sun. It had been 5 years since the cancer had taken her, and the silence she'd left behind was still a physical presence in the house. Amelia had been a world-renowned botanist, and this house, this life, had been their shared dream. Her greenhouse, a magnificent glass cathedral attached to the main house, was his sanctuary now. It was filled with her collection of rare and exotic plants, a living library he tended to with a devotion that bordered on religious. He knew the Latin name for every specimen, its needs, its history, its poisons, and its cures. He'd agreed to this dinner with Arthur Reed out of a reluctant sense of duty. Reed's firm managed a portion of his charitable foundation's endowment, and Arthur was a competent, if uninspired, manager. The thought of enduring an evening of small talk with Reed's notoriously brittle wife was exhausting. Since Amelia's death, the world of social gatherings and power dinners had lost all its flavor. It felt like a pointless, noisy charade. He adjusted his tie, his reflection a somber figure in the mirror. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, his only real connection to the world now rooted in the soil and stems of Amelia's legacy. That legacy, that deep, encyclopedic knowledge of the plant kingdom, was something he kept to himself. It was a private language he had shared only with his wife. He had no idea that tonight, that secret language was about to be spoken by the most unlikely of people. Clara arrived for her shift at Aurelia, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Every night was a tightrope walk. Her first table was a pair of tourists, thrilled and wide-eyed, easy to please. Her second was a regular, a kind old gentleman who always asked about her studies. Then the host seated table 7, Arthur and Evelyn Reed, joined by Julian Croft. Clara recognized the Reeds instantly. Mrs. Reed was infamous among the staff, known for her impossible demands and her habit of trying to get servers fired over imagined slights. Clara took a deep, calming breath, straightening her apron. She could do this. She'd handled her grandmother during her most difficult sundowning episodes. She could handle one unpleasant socialite. As she approached the table, she noticed the centerpiece. It was stunning. A single, large, trumpet-shaped white flower in a crystal vase, its petals unfurling in the candlelight. Most people would see only its beauty. Clara saw Datura Righti, the sacred Datura. She knew it was a night-blooming flower, a member of the nightshade family. She knew every part of the plant was powerfully toxic if ingested, containing atropine and scopolamine. She knew it was beautiful, but dangerous. A small, involuntary smile touched her lips. It was Amelia Croft's favorite flower. She'd read about it in one of Amelia's books. The irony of it sitting on Julian Croft's table was not lost on her. "Good evening. My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with some water?" she began, her voice calm and professional. Evelyn Reed didn't even look at her. "We'll have a bottle of the Petrus 82, and make sure it's decanted properly this time. The last girl who served us practically bruised it." The condescension was immediate and potent. Julian Croft looked up from the menu, his gaze lingering on Clara for a moment longer than necessary. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes as she looked at the flower, a spark of recognition he hadn't expected. He dismissed it as a trick of the light. Clara moved with quiet efficiency, her service flawless. She presented the wine, decanted it with a surgeon's precision, and recited the evening's specials from memory, her descriptions vivid and enticing. She was a ghost, just as she'd planned to be. But Evelyn Reed seemed determined to materialize her. "Is this butter grass-fed?" she demanded, poking at a small dish. "Yes, ma'am, from a local farm in upstate New York." "And the scallops? Are they diver-caught or dredged?" "I refuse to eat dredged scallops." "They are diver-caught from Maine," Clara answered patiently, having memorized the sourcing of every ingredient on the menu. Julian Croft watched the exchange, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, in his eyes. He'd seen titans of industry crumble under less scrutiny. This young woman was unflappable. He found himself more interested in her quiet composure than in Arthur Reed's droning monologue about market projections. The tension escalated during the main course. Evelyn sent her steak back twice, claiming it was overcooked, though to everyone else at the table, it looked perfectly medium rare. Each time, Clara accepted the complaint with grace, apologizing profusely and rushing the plate back to the kitchen, where the chef threw his hands up in frustration. "She does this every time," he grumbled to Clara. "She just likes the power trip." Clara just nodded. "One more time, chef, please." When she returned with the third steak, Evelyn waved her away. "My appetite is ruined. Just take it away, and bring me another glass of wine." As Clara reached for the empty glass, Evelyn shifted her arm abruptly, knocking the full, heavy bottle of Petrus. It tipped, splashing a significant amount of the dark red wine onto the tablecloth near Evelyn's plate. It was a clear accident caused by the guest, but Evelyn saw an opportunity. "You clumsy oaf!" she hissed, the volume just low enough to be a targeted strike. She picked up her own nearly full glass of wine, and that's when she made her move. With a flick of her wrist, she flung the contents of her glass sideways. The wine arced through the air, splashing not onto Clara, but onto the empty chair beside her and the floor. But the motion was aggressive, theatrical, and then she shrieked, "Look what you've done!" And that's when the entire restaurant went silent. The manager, a man named Philip, rushed over. "Mrs. Reed, is everything all right?" "All right?" she screeched, standing up. This girl just assaulted me. She spilled wine all over my cooter dress." She gestured vaguely at her perfectly clean, cream-colored dress. The only wine was on the table, nowhere near her. But in the dim light, in the chaos of the moment, it was an accusation that hung in the air with the weight of gospel. Philip looked at Clara, his face a mixture of panic and fury. "What happened?" And that's when Clara spoke, her voice shaking but clear. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I didn't spill that wine. You threw it." Evelyn gasped, clutching her pearls. "How dare you? You're not only incompetent, you're a liar. I want her fired, now." Philip looked from the powerful, wealthy client to the disposable, hourly wage waitress. It wasn't a choice for him. It was a business decision. "Young lady, apologize to Mrs. Reed immediately." "I have nothing to apologize for," Clara said, her chin lifting. All those years of forced invisibility, of swallowing insults, of smiling through humiliation, it all coalesced into a single, unshakable point of resistance. "I will not apologize for something I didn't do." Julian Croft, who had watched the entire sequence of events with cold, analytical clarity, leaned forward slightly. He'd seen Evelyn's wrist flick. He knew the girl was telling the truth, but he remained silent, observing. He wanted to see how she would handle this. It was a test of sorts. Evelyn, enraged by Clara's defiance, took it a step further. Her eyes darted around, looking for more ammunition. She spotted her diamond earring, which she had discreetly slipped off earlier because the back was pinching her. It sat on the table beside her bread plate. In a flash of malevolent inspiration, she subtly swiped it into her lap. "And my earring!" she cried, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "My diamond earring is gone. She must have taken it when she leaned over." The accusation was monstrous. It transformed the situation from a service dispute into a criminal matter. Philip's face went white. My earring was right here, Evelyn insisted, pointing to the empty spot on the table. It's a 2-carat diamond from Graf. She stole it. Check her pockets. The humiliation was crushing. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, convicting her. She thought of her grandmother, of the bills on her table, of her scholarship that had a strict morality clause. An accusation like this could ruin everything. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. I did not steal anything, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. That's enough, Philip said, his voice hard. Clara, you're fired, and you will stay right here until we call the police. Evelyn smiled, a thin, triumphant smirk. She had won. She had utterly destroyed this impertinent little waitress. To seal her victory, she decided to add a touch of medical drama. Her eyes fell on the beautiful white datura flower in the center of the table. And I think I'm having a reaction, she said, her voice suddenly weak. She reached out and brushed her fingers against the petal of the flower. My hand, it's going numb. I feel dizzy. This flower, is it poisonous? She slumped back in her chair, one hand on her forehead, the other, the one that had supposedly touched the flower, dangling limply. It was a brilliant performance. It painted her as the victim of not just theft and incompetence, but of a physically dangerous environment. Philip's panic intensified, but it was a fatal mistake. She had just stepped into Clara's world. The fear in Clara's eyes vanished, replaced by something else. Focus. The adrenaline surging through her wasn't from panic anymore. It was from pure, unadulterated knowledge. The world slowed down. The murmuring diners, the frantic manager, the triumphant socialite, they all faded into the background. All she saw was the plant. She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the manufactured chaos. It was no longer the voice of a timid waitress. It was the voice of a scientist. That's impossible, she said. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open. What did you say, you little thief? I said that's impossible, Clara repeated, her voice gaining strength. The symptoms you're describing, sudden numbness from casual skin contact, immediate dizziness, they are inconsistent with the toxicology of Datura rhydi. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Julian Croft's eyes widened. He sat bolt upright, his newspaper completely forgotten. He knew that name. He knew that plant. And he knew she was right. Clara continued, now addressing the entire room as if it were a lecture hall. The primary toxic alkaloids in sacred datura are atropine and scopolamine. They are anticholinergic. For them to be absorbed through the skin in a quantity sufficient to cause systemic effects, you would need prolonged exposure to a concentrated poultice, not a brief touch of a petal. And even then, the initial symptoms would not be numbness and dizziness. She took another step closer, her gaze locked on Evelyn. The first signs of datura poisoning are a severely dry mouth, blurred vision due to pupil dilation, a rapid heartbeat, and flushed skin. Numbness isn't a primary symptom. Furthermore, any significant toxic absorption would almost certainly leave traces of pollen or plant oils on your skin. I'd be happy to wait while a forensics team swabs your hand. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy, and profound. Clara had just dismantled Evelyn's lie piece by piece with cold, hard science. She had taken Evelyn's chosen weapon, the flower, and turned it against her with devastating precision. Evelyn Reed stared at her, her jaw slack. The color drained from her face, leaving her expertly applied makeup looking like a grotesque mask. The act was over. The lie was exposed. Julian Croft finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the effortless authority of a man who hadn't needed to raise it in decades. She's correct, he said simply. Every head swiveled towards the corner booth. The sight of Julian Croft, the mythical recluse inserting himself into the drama, was more shocking than the drama itself. He placed his newspaper neatly on the table and stood up. He walked over to table 7, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Clara. He looked directly at Evelyn Reed. Every word she said is accurate, he repeated. My late wife was a leading expert on the Solanacci family. I spent 30 years of my life listening to her Talk about these plants. The girl knows what she's talking about. He then turned his steely gaze on Philip, the manager. You were about to call the police on your employee based on a lie, and you nearly allowed this woman to create a medical panic based on another? Philip sputtered. Mr. Croft, I had no idea. Julian ignored him. His eyes returned to Evelyn, and they were glacial. And as for the earring, he said, his voice dropping even lower, I imagine if you stand up, Mrs. Reed, we might find it has miraculously reappeared. Checkmate. Evelyn was trapped. Every eye in the room was on her. She was a cornered animal, her face a storm of fury, humiliation, and panic. She knew if she stood up, the earring would fall from her lap, exposing her final, most vicious lie. Arthur Reed, who had been frozen in silent horror throughout the entire spectacle, finally moved. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in years, the weary resignation in his eyes was replaced by a look of utter disgust. He stood up, threw a black Amex card on the table, and said in a low, shaking voice, We're leaving. He pulled his wife roughly to her feet. As she stood, a small, glittering object fell from the folds of her dress and clattered onto the polished floor. The diamond earring. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. A collective gasp went through the dining room. Several phones, which had been recording discreetly, were now held up openly, their small red lights blinking with predatory focus. The Reeds were frozen in a tableau of public disgrace. The manager, Philip, looked as though he might faint. He stared at the earring on the floor, then at Clara, then at Julian Croft, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the disaster. He had sided with the liar. He had threatened the truth-teller. He had allowed his temple of fine dining to become a stage for a cheap, vicious farce. Evelyn Reed's face, already pale, became ashen. She tried to speak, to salvage some shred of dignity, but no words came out. It was Clara who broke the silence. She bent down, picked up the diamond earring, and held it out to Evelyn, her hand perfectly steady. You dropped this, ma'am, she said, her voice devoid of triumph or malice. It was simple, factual, and utterly devastating. Evelyn flinched as if the earring were red hot. Her husband snatched it from Clara's hand, grabbed his wife's arm, and practically dragged her towards the exit. They walked a gauntlet of silent, staring faces and raised iPhones. The click of Evelyn's heels on the marble floor was a frantic, desperate rhythm, the sound of a social queen being run out of her own kingdom. The doors of Aurelia swung shut behind them, leaving a profound and ringing silence in their wake. Julian Croft turned to Philip. You owe this young woman an apology, he said, his voice cold as iron, and I suggest you make it a good one. I will be speaking with the owners of this establishment in the morning. I am a silent partner in the hospitality group that owns this building. I imagine they'll be very interested in my perspective on your management style. Philip's blood ran cold. He hadn't known. No one had known. The cool night air of the city hit her not as a relief, but as a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. For a moment, she was back in the restaurant, suspended in that terrible, ringing silence after the Reed's departure. Now, the cacophony of Manhattan traffic was a different kind of assault, a chaotic roar that mirrored the storm inside her. Her hands, she noticed with a strange detachment, were shaking violently. It wasn't the tremor of fear anymore, but the aftershock of adrenaline, a raw, kinetic energy with nowhere to go. She braced herself against the cold brick of the building, the rough texture a grounding sensation against her palm. She had not walked out. She had detonated her life. The word quit had felt like an act of power in the moment, a final, definitive severing. Now, in the anonymity of the street, it felt like a leap from a cliff without checking for the water below. The manager's panicked, sweaty face swam in her vision, the awe in the eyes of her co-workers, the impenetrable, assessing gaze of Julian Croft. She had held the attention of a room full of the city's most powerful people, not as a servant, but as an equal, a peer in knowledge. The memory was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But pride, she knew with the brutal clarity of 1,000 unpaid bills, did not keep the lights on. It did not buy her grandmother's medication. A sob, raw and ugly, tore its way from her chest. She pressed her forehead against the cool brick, letting the tears come, hot and silent. They were not tears of humiliation, but of a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. For the first time in years, she had not swallowed the injustice. She had not smiled through the condescension. She had stood on the foundation of her own hard-won knowledge and refused to be moved. The cost of that refusal was now crashing down upon her. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her slacks. She ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. A call from Maria, her grandmother's evening caregiver. Clara's heart seized. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and answered, forcing her voice into a semblance of calm. "Maria, is everything okay?" "Clara, honey, everything is fine." The older woman's warm voice was a balm. "I just wanted to let you know, Eleanor had a good evening. We were looking at one of her old books, the one with the pictures of the English gardens. She was talking about Gertrude Jekyll. A real conversation. I thought you'd want to know." The simple, profound goodness of the news was almost too much to bear. "Thank you, Maria. That's wonderful. Thank you for calling." "Of course, sweetie. Get some rest. You sound tired." Clara hung up, a fresh wave of tears blurring the city lights into a watercolor smear. We protect each other. That was the promise. And tonight, standing on a street corner, jobless and shaking, she felt as though she had failed. She had chosen her own dignity over her grandmother's security. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. The next 24 hours were a blur of disorientation. She didn't sleep. Instead, she wandered her small apartment, a ghost in her own life, tending to her plants with meticulous, almost feverish care. She checked the soil moisture of the pothos, misted the orchid, rotated the African violet for even light. Here in the silent green world was a logic and order that had vanished from her human one. These living things responded to care, to knowledge. They did not lie or accuse or demand. They simply grew. This was her language. By morning, the internet had caught fire. A friend texted her a link with a simple, "OMG, Clara?" The video was shaky, filmed from a nearby table. It captured the entire drama. Evelyn's theatrical shriek, Clara's calm, clear voice cutting through the noise, her precise scientific dismantling of the lie. It captured the fall of the earring, the Reed's walk of shame. It was all there, a 5-minute opera of hubris and comeuppance. The comments section was a raging river of schadenfreude and praise. They were calling her the botany badass, the waitress of wrath. She was a meme, a hero, a symbol. It felt profoundly unreal, like watching a movie about someone else. The praise was validating, but it was also objectifying. They celebrated her victory, but none of them knew about the stack of bills on her kitchen table or the gnawing fear of the future. Her phone began to ring incessantly with numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, she assumed. She put it on silent, the screen lighting up with notifications like a frantic beacon. She felt besieged, exposed. The world that had once rendered her invisible was now staring at her with a million unblinking eyes. Late in the afternoon, a single email slipped through her self-imposed blockade. The subject line was simple: a meeting. The sender was an address at the Croft Foundation. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She read the message, written in the crisp, impersonal language of a corporate assistant. Miss Evans. On behalf of Mr. Julian Croft, I would like to request a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Mr. Croft has a proposition he wishes to discuss in person. A car can be sent to your address at a time of your choosing. Regards, wait. Marcus Vance, Executive Assistant to Mr. Julian Croft. A proposition. The word was both tantalizing and ominous. Was it a gesture of charity? A payoff to ensure her silence? Her pride, still raw and tender from the night before, bristled at the thought. But beneath the pride was the cold, hard pragmatism of a survivor. She typed a short, simple reply, agreeing to a meeting the following morning. She had to know. The next day, a silent, immaculate black sedan whispered to a stop outside her Queen's walk-up. The driver, a man in a dark suit, held the door for her as if she were royalty. The contrast between the gleaming luxury of the car and the crumbling facade of her building was jarring. As they drove, the city unfolded and then reformed around them. the gritty urban landscape of Queens giving way to the manicured avenues of Manhattan, and finally the sprawling sylvan estates of Connecticut. It was a journey across social and economic continents. She wasn't taken to the main house, a formidable structure of stone and glass she could glimpse through the trees. Instead, the car followed a winding path to a separate, magnificent building, the greenhouse. It was less a building than a captured piece of sky, a cathedral of glass and black steel that seemed to hum with contained life. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and the clean, green smell of living chlorophyll. The muted sounds of the outside world vanished, replaced by the gentle drip of an irrigation system and the rustle of immense leaves. Light, filtered through 1,000 shades of green, dappled the stone pathways. It was a library of life, and she felt a sense of reverence so profound it was almost a physical ache. Julian Croft was not waiting for her in a suit. He was on his knees by a bed of what looked like struggling calathea, his hands deep in the soil. He wore a faded work shirt, denim worn soft with use, and a pair of mud-caked boots. The austere, intimidating billionaire from the restaurant was gone. In his place was a gardener. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes clear and analytical. He rose slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Evans, thank you for coming." His voice was the same, quiet and resonant, but it held a different timbre here, softened by the acoustics of the living space. "Mr. Croft," she said, her own voice barely a whisper, "this place, it's a sanctuary." "It was my wife's," he said, and the statement hung in the warm air, full of unspoken history. "Amelia, she called it her silent conversation. Plants don't have egos, she used to say. They only have needs. Fulfilling them is a purer transaction than any business deal." He gestured for her to walk with him, his long strides unhurried. They moved past towering palms and tree ferns whose fronds created a canopy high above them. "Last night, you spoke about datura riti. You spoke with a clarity and a lack of emotion that I recognized. It was the voice of science. Amelia had that voice. She could look at the most beautiful flower in the world and see only its chemical composition, its evolutionary strategy for survival. It wasn't a lack of romance. It was a deeper kind of respect." He stopped before a small, unassuming plant with delicate fern-like leaves. Affixed to its pot was a plastic label, the Latin name Mimosa pudica, written in an elegant, slightly faded cursive. "That's Amelia's handwriting," he said softly. "I've kept all her original labels. I have a team of horticulturalists, the best money can buy. They keep this place alive, but they don't speak the language. They follow instructions. They maintain the status quo. They see a collection of assets. They don't see her conversation." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I investigated you, Miss Evans. I hope you don't find that intrusive. I needed to understand. Columbia scholarship, top marks in phytochemistry and botany, a grandmother with Alzheimer's who was herself a landscape architect. It all coalesced. The knowledge you displayed wasn't a fluke." "My grandmother taught me how to see," Clara said simply. "The university is teaching me how to understand what I'm seeing." "Precisely." He led her to the bed of struggling calathea he'd been working on. Their beautiful patterned leaves were curling at the edges, their vibrant colors muted and tinged with brown. "My team is stumped," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching her. "They've adjusted the light, the water, the humidity. They suspect a nutrient deficiency, but the soil tests are normal. What do you see?" It was a test. The realization was immediate. This was the real interview. All the chaos of the restaurant had just been the prelude. She knelt, her earlier nervousness dissolving, replaced by the cool, comforting focus of diagnosis. She ignored the billionaire standing over her and gave her attention to the patient. She ran her fingers lightly over a curling leaf, feeling its brittle texture. She examined the underside, looking for pests. Nothing. She gently brushed away some of the topsoil near the base of the stem, and then she saw it, a faint, web-like white growth on the soil's surface, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Mycelium. It's not a nutrient issue, she said, her voice confident. And it's not the light or the water. It's the soil. It's a fungal pathogen, likely a form of Pythium root rot. You can see the mycelium traces here, she pointed. Your team is right that the symptoms look like underwatering or nutrient burn, but that's because the fungus is attacking the roots, so the plant can't absorb water or nutrients properly, no matter how much is available. More water would just make it worse. She stood up, meeting his gaze. You'd need to unpot them all immediately, trim away any blackened, mushy roots, and repot in fresh, sterilized soil with better drainage. A systemic fungicide treatment would be advisable. Julian Croft was silent for a long moment. He looked from the plants to Clara, and a slow, profound change occurred in his expression. The guard he held around himself seemed to lower, brick by brick. He was not just seeing a bright student anymore. He was seeing a peer. In 5 years, he said, his voice quiet with a new weight, no one has been able to tell me something about this collection I didn't already know. Until today. He gestured toward a small seating area tucked under the broad leaves of a Monstera deliciosa. I am establishing a research foundation in my wife's name, the Amelia Croft Conservatory. This place will no longer be a private collection. It will become a living library for botanical research, a place for conservation and education. But a library needs a librarian. It needs a curator, someone who can continue the conversation. He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. This isn't charity, Miss Evans. Charity is writing a check to assuage guilt. This is an investment. I want to offer you the position of curator in training and eventually the full head curator role. You will work alongside me. Your salary will be substantial, enough to provide the finest full-time care for your grandmother. A cottage here on the estate is available for you both. Your remaining tuition at Columbia and any postgraduate studies you wish to pursue will be covered by the foundation. He held up a hand before she could speak. The work will be demanding. I will expect you to learn every single plant in this collection, its history, its chemistry, its needs. I will expect you to contribute to research proposals and eventually publish. I am not offering you a refuge. I am offering you a life's work, a purpose that, I suspect, you were already well on your way to finding for yourself. I am merely providing the soil for it to grow. Clara sank onto one of the benches, the sheer, impossible scale of his offer washing over her. She thought of her cramped apartment, of the constant, grinding worry about money, of the painful choice she thought she'd made between her dignity and her duty. It wasn't a choice at all. It was a doorway, the knowledge that Eleanor had so painstakingly gifted her, the passion that had been her private escape, had become her public salvation. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of such profound relief and gratitude that they felt like they were coming from the deepest part of her soul. Yes, she whispered, the word feeling small and inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. Mr. Croft, yes, thank you. Julian, he corrected her gently. A rare, fleeting smile touched his lips. Amelia would have insisted. Welcome to the conversation, Clara. The months that followed were a period of deep, transformative growth. The cottage on the estate was bathed in sunlight, its windows looking out over a meadow. A team of gentle, expert caregivers attended to Eleanor, whose health in the calm and beautiful surroundings stabilized. The agitated confusion of sundowning lessened, replaced by long stretches of peaceful quiet. Clara moved her small jungle of houseplants from Queens, arranging them on the windowsills, a familiar green bridge between her old life and her new one. Some afternoons, she would wheel her grandmother through the warm, humid pathways of the greenhouse. She would point to a vibrant bromeliad or a delicate orchid, explaining its origins and habits, her voice a soft murmur. It was a perfect, poignant reversal of their roles, a returning of the gift. One day, as they passed a towering bird of paradise plant, its magnificent orange and blue flower in full bloom, Eleanor reached out a frail hand. Strelitzia reginae, she murmured, her voice thin but clear, named for Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Clara stopped the wheelchair, her heart constricting. For a single luminous moment, the fog had parted. Her grandmother was there. That's right, Grandma, she whispered, squeezing her hand. That's exactly right. The Reeds, meanwhile, discovered that social capital is far more volatile than financial capital. The video was their ruin. It wasn't the spilled wine or the lie about the dress that destroyed them. It was the chilling, calculated cruelty of the planted earring. It revealed a rottenness of character that even their wealthiest friends could not stomach. Invitations dried up. Business deals faltered. The brittle architecture of Evelyn's rage, with no one left to lash out at, turned inward. Their divorce was finalized in less than a year, a quiet, ignominious end to an empire built on a foundation of insecurity. Clara's life was now defined by Latin names and chemical compounds, by the patient, methodical work of cataloging, propagating, and researching. Julian was a demanding but brilliant mentor, pushing her, questioning her, celebrating her insights. They worked side by side, two solitary people finding a shared purpose in the silent world of plants. One evening, nearly a year after that night at Aurelia, Clara was working late in the greenhouse laboratory, analyzing the alkaloid content of a rare medicinal vine. Julian walked in, holding 2 mugs of tea. He placed one beside her microscope without a word and stood looking out at the vast collection, its forms softened into silhouettes by the twilight. "I spoke with the director of the Amazonian Conservation Trust today," he said. "They've approved our grant proposal. The foundation is funding a new research outpost in Peru. They want you to consult on the project." Clara looked up, stunned. "Me? But I'm still a student." "You are the curator of this conservatory," he stated, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "Your name is on the proposal. Your preliminary research was the basis for it." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just the pride of a mentor, but the deep, quiet respect of a colleague. Amelia always dreamed of a project like this. Clara looked from his face to the rows upon rows of living things stretching out before her in the gathering dark. She thought of the trembling, terrified girl who had walked out of a restaurant into the unknown. She thought of the quiet strength that had been cultivated in her by a grandmother's love, nurtured by overdue library books, and tested in a crucible of public humiliation. Evelyn Reed had tried to define her by her apron. She had failed. Her real identity was here, rooted in the rich soil of knowledge, reaching for the light. She had found her ecosystem. She was home,